You ever stumble on a war story so strange that for a moment you think someone must have mixed up the pages in the history book? Something that makes you stop, lean back a little, and whisper, "Wait, they did what?" That's exactly what happened the first time American pilots walked up to a captured Japanese Mitsubishi G4M, better known by its Allied code name, the Betty bomber, and discovered to their absolute disbelief that this sleek, deadly machine had fuel tanks as fragile as paper lanterns. Not self-sealing, not armored, just thin metal sitting out there like an open invitation for every angry bullet in the sky. And the look on the Americans' faces that day, well, you can imagine. One pilot actually muttered, "No wonder these things burn like funeral torches." Another just shook his head and walked around the wing as if maybe the designers had hidden protection somewhere clever. They hadn't. Now, before we plunge into this strange story of engineering choices, desperation, courage, and a kind of tragic brilliance, let me take a second to ask you something. If you love history the way I do, if these old war tales stir something in you, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Tap that like button, and share this with anyone in your life who can't resist a good World War II mystery. It helps more than you'd think, and it lets me keep sitting here telling these long fireside stories for you. Alright, let's dive in. The thing about the Betty bomber is that it didn't look dangerous at first glance. It looked elegant, graceful, almost delicate, the way some of those pre-war airliners used to look. Long, thin wings, a perfectly clean fuselage, no bulky armor plates or heavy lumps hanging off the sides. But don't let that fool you. Beneath all that beauty was one of the most feared Japanese aircraft of the early Pacific War. A lot of American crews who fought in 1942 and 1943 still remembered it with a shiver, even decades later. It could outrange almost anything in the sky. It carried torpedoes that ripped battleships open like tin cans. It could strike from distances that made U.S. commanders feel like the ocean itself wasn't big enough to keep them safe. But she had one terrible flaw. A flaw everyone knew but no one talked about on the Japanese side, because what else could they do? The Betty burned. She burned easily, she burned fast, and once she caught, there was no saving her. Pilots called her the flying cigar. Some said the one-shot lighter. You'd see a streak of flame and falling metal and know it was a G4M, and the reason, as American intelligence teams discovered when they finally examined a captured one close-up, was painfully simple. No self-sealing fuel tanks, not even the hint of them. Now you might hear that today and think, well, maybe Japan hadn't invented them yet. Oh, they had. Their engineers weren't foolish. They understood what self-sealing tanks did. They even knew how to make them, but they also knew something else. Japan's entire naval strategy rested on the idea of extreme range. They needed aircraft that could fly farther than American planes, much farther. In the Pacific, distance was power. Distance meant a strike force could hit you and slip away before you even knew which direction it came from. So Japanese designers stripped the Betty down. They removed armor, they removed tank protection, they removed anything that weighed so much as a handful of extra kilograms. They built her like a racehorse, lean, light, and meant to run across half an ocean on fumes. And for a while that gamble worked. In 1941 and 1942, Betties helped sink British warships off Malaya. They bombed Darwin. They tore apart the early Allied defenses in the Dutch East Indies. Whenever a torpedo bomber came screaming in low over the waves, chances were high it was a Betty. But war changes, enemies adapt. By the time American fighters like the F-4F Wildcat and later the F-6F Hellcat met the Betty in real numbers, the Japanese crews began to pay for the aircraft's beautiful but deadly weakness. A single tracer round into those wings could start a fire that turned the whole bomber into a falling sun. And the Americans noticed. Oh, they noticed. Pilots wrote home about it. Gunners talked about it in after-action debriefs. Navy commanders mentioned it in their reports. But it wasn't until American forces captured a mostly intact Betty on a Pacific airfield, left behind during a hasty Japanese withdrawal, that they finally got to see the truth with their own eyes. There's a photograph from that day, grainy, black and white, but clear enough. You see 3 American pilots standing under the wing of the bomber, arms folded, staring up with expressions that mix curiosity and disbelief. One of them is pointing at the fuel tank, the way a man points at an electrical fuse that shouldn't possibly be connected that way. And the report from that inspection still exists. It describes the fuel system as unprotected, thin, Heil. Why vulnerable and extraordinarily dangerous in combat scenarios? The pilot who wrote the notes added a sentence in the margin: Betty crews must have been brave as hell. That's what struck the Americans hardest. Not the engineering flaw, not the tactical consequences. The courage. Imagine climbing into that machine every day knowing that if someone so much as sneezed a bullet at the wrong angle, your aircraft could turn into a torch. Japanese crews joked about it because what else could they do? Humor helps you stay sane. One Betty navigator later said in an interview that the first time he flew over Guadalcanal, he kept smelling fuel in the cabin and wondering if maybe he should start writing his will. Another pilot said he used to pat the side of the fuselage before takeoff and whisper, "Not today, old girl, not today." And yet, despite all that danger, the Betty bomber continued to fly mission after mission. Why? Well, that's where the story gets deeper than metal and machinery. Japan didn't have much choice. Their early successes had stretched their forces far across the Pacific, and they needed long-range bombers to hold it all together. Their industry couldn't simply redesign an aircraft mid-war the way the United States could. They didn't have the oil reserves, the factories, or the steel to build heavier bombers with thick armor. So they kept using the Betty. They kept sending crews into the sky in a machine that expected perfection. You fly like a ghost and maybe, just maybe, you come home. Meanwhile, the Americans were trying to understand the design philosophy behind it. When U.S. engineers opened those fuel tanks and saw nothing, no rubberized layers, no resin compounds, no sealing strips, they were baffled. One of them wrote, "It appears entirely absent of protection," as though he needed to check his eyes again. Another wrote, "The Japanese have made a conscious trade of survivability for range." That was the true heart of it, a conscious trade, a deliberate gamble. But as the war dragged on, that gamble grew crueler. The Americans had better fighters now, faster, heavier, armed with cannons and larger caliber machine guns that tore through thin aluminum like it wasn't even there. Every month, the Betty's survival rate fell. Some Japanese pilots said flying her late in the war felt like bringing a paper glider to a gunfight. And yet they went, again and again. When the Americans finally brought a captured Betty back to a test airfield, wheels wobbling because the landing gear was never designed for rough treatment, they examined every inch. They sat inside the cockpit and marveled at how open and exposed everything felt. They tested the engines, the control surfaces, the bomb bay mechanisms. But the moment they reached those fuel tanks, everything got quiet. You can almost picture the scene. A small circle of pilots and engineers standing around the open wing, staring at the thing that had killed so many Japanese crews by accident and intention. One pilot poked the tank wall with a finger. It flexed, actually flexed, and he stepped back with an expression that said everything. This shouldn't be in a combat aircraft. But here's the twist, and it's one of the reasons the Betty bomber deserves more respect than it gets today. Despite her fragility, she was deadly. The longest-range twin-engine bomber of the war, able to launch torpedo strikes at night, fly reconnaissance over entire island chains, and slip into gaps American commanders didn't even know they had. The men who flew her weren't fools. They were skilled, calm, and fully aware of the risks. There's a mission that still stands out, the attack that killed Admiral Yamamoto in 1943. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was flying in a Betty that morning. And even though U.S. fighters brought that bomber down, the crew tried everything to keep her in the air. They fought the machine, nursed failing engines, tried to glide her toward the jungle. But the Betty wasn't built to take that kind of beating. She did what she always did when the fuel tanks were hit. She burned. Now, I'm going to pause here for just a heartbeat, because we're getting into the deeper part of this story, the kind that follows the pilots, the engineers, the desperate late-war missions, and the American test crews who kept shaking their heads at what they were seeing. If you're enjoying this so far, go ahead and say. The hangar felt different the next morning. Quiet in a way that made every footstep echo like a drum. The sun wasn't even up yet, but the air was already warm and heavy. A few ground crew wandered around with coffee cups, rubbing sleep from their eyes, waiting for orders. And right there in the middle of all that half-awake shuffling, the captured Betty sat under a big canvas tarp, almost like the Japanese bomber was embarrassed to be seen in broad daylight. Someone had stenciled a small American star on the fuselage, crooked and uneven, a rem. In dare that even trophies of war had to obey the rules of the airfield. When they pulled the tarp back, a small cloud of dust hopped into the air. It sparkled for a moment in the first thin line of morning light. The Betty looked tired herself, as if the long journey from Rabaul to Allied hands had aged her decades. But the thing about airplanes, even the ones built with questionable decisions, is that they're honest. They tell you exactly who they are the moment you open their panels. And the Betty, bless her heart, wasn't shy about showing her secrets. The first order of business that day was to drain the tanks without lighting half the base on fire. A couple of the crew crouched under the wing, fiddling with the fuel lines. One of them muttered that he could smell gasoline from 10 feet away. That wasn't normal. On American aircraft, even the early war models, fuel systems were sealed as tight as submarine hatches. On this thing, you just had to nudge a valve and the fumes hit you like a slap. Once the last drop was out, the pilots and mechanics crawled inside again. The fuselage felt even more cramped in the morning, as if overnight the walls had crept closer. The Betty was built for range, not comfort. Long wings, thin structure, lightweight everything. Good for flying far, terrible for surviving long enough to land. The kind of plane where the engineers said, "Let's shave 1 more pound," and someone else said, "Well, we could remove that armor plate," and everyone nodded, even though deep down they knew it wasn't wise. One of the technical officers, a fellow named Danvers, was the kind of man who liked to poke things with a screwdriver. He tapped on the inner skin near the wing spar. A hollow ring echoed back, "Not good." He tapped again on the panel covering the fuel tank. Same sound. Someone asked him what that meant. He stared at them for a long second, raised his eyebrows, and said, "It means exactly what you think it means." Nobody laughed this time. Word started to spread around the airfield. You know how gossip travels faster than radio waves. Soon, junior pilots, crew chiefs, even cooks and clerks drifted toward the hangar, pretending they just happened to be walking by. People are curious by nature. Show them a captured enemy bomber and they'll find any excuse to take a look, even if they don't know a fuel tank from a coffee pot. Someone would step inside, shake their head in disbelief, step out and tell the next person, "You gotta see this with your own eyes." And so the crowd grew, not rowdy but quietly stunned. Around mid-morning, the test pilot group arrived to begin their evaluation flight planning. These were serious men, but even they had this look of disbelief plastered on their faces. You could have told them the Betty was made entirely out of bamboo and chewing gum, and they might have believed you after peeking at those tanks. They spent hours combing through the flight manuals captured with the aircraft. The Japanese documents were neatly written, perfectly organized, clear in their own way. Not a single mention of armor-protected tanks. Plenty of notes about how to reduce weight for long missions, though. The test group shook their heads, muttering about the odd priorities of their adversaries. They weren't mocking, they were just trying to wrap their minds around it. Why build an airplane that could fly 1,000 miles only to let it burn if it got sneezed at by enemy fire? By noon, the sun was baking the corrugated roof of the hangar, and the air grew thick enough to chew. One of the mechanics wiped his forehead and said he felt like he was standing inside a microwave. But the pilots didn't seem to care. They kept pointing at diagrams and poking at the bomber's belly like it was some kind of puzzle from a different world. Then came the part nobody was looking forward to, examining the self-sealing mechanism, or what little there was of it. American and British planes had layers of rubberized material that swelled when hit by fuel, closing bullet holes like a miracle. The Japanese version, at least on this model, was more of a wish than a guarantee. A thin sheet here, a strip there. Enough to look intentional, but not enough to actually save lives. The technical officer peeled back one of the layers. It crackled, brittle from heat and age. He held it up between his fingers, frowning. You didn't need to be an expert to know it wasn't going to stop anything bigger than a pebble. Someone quietly said, "Poor devils," and that was that. The mood shifted again. By early afternoon, the airfield commander showed up, towering over everyone with his pressed uniform and stern expression. He took a long look at the bomber and asked for a briefing. The test group explained everything they'd found so far, and every few sentences the commander's eyes grew narrower, not out of anger, more out of disbelief. When they told him about the unprotected tanks, he finally let out a long sigh. Like a man who had read a terrible joke and didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I remember the way one of the older crew chiefs leaned close to a young pilot, whispering like he was passing on forbidden wisdom. He said the Japanese designers were playing a game of consequences. They wanted range. They needed range. They had to reach far-flung islands, deep ocean positions, and scattered bases. To do that, they had to lighten the aircraft. And to lighten the aircraft, they had to sacrifice something. Protection was the easiest thing to cut. Maybe, he said, the Japanese figured their pilots wouldn't get hit if they were fast enough. Or maybe they simply didn't want to face the fact that sometimes the only thing that keeps a man alive is a few extra pounds of rubber and steel. It's a strange thing when you stand in front of an enemy machine and see the fingerprints of the people who built it. We tend to imagine the war as faceless armies clashing on maps, but aviation reminds you that every bolt, every panel, every weld was done by someone's hands. The Betty's hands left a story, and the Americans reading it felt both frustrated and oddly sympathetic. Late that afternoon, as the light softened and shadows stretched long across the ground, another group arrived, intelligence officers. These were the sharp-eyed fellows who had to piece together enemy doctrine from scraps. They asked for photographs, measurements, detailed notes. They climbed all over the bomber, careful not to disturb the delicate structure. One of them slid a ruler across the tank and shook his head. "Thin as a biscuit tin," he murmured. Another wrote something long and frantic in his notebook. They debated for nearly an hour about Japanese priorities. Some argued that the enemy simply didn't care about pilot survival. Others said that wasn't fair. The Japanese Empire might have been ruthless, but they weren't foolish. Someone else said they were influenced by a different aviation philosophy entirely. One focused on reaching targets at extreme distances. And if your entire war strategy depends on stretching the limits of what aircraft can do, maybe you make peace with the risks. One of the intelligence men brought up early war American bombers that also cut corners. That got a few nods. Everyone remembered the hard lessons of 1941 and 1942, when the US had to learn the same brutal truths in blood. Maybe the Japanese were stuck in those years, unable to adapt as fast. War has a way of punishing slow learners. Now, before we press deeper into what those intelligence officers discovered, take a moment. Yeah, you sitting right there listening. If you're enjoying this dive into the strange and human side of wartime aviation, don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. And if you know someone who loves these hidden corners of history as much as you do, share this video with them. It helps more than you'd think, and it keeps stories like this alive. Anyway, back to the hangar. As the night crept in and the air cooled, the officers gathered around a folding table lit by a single lamp that buzzed like an angry insect. They laid out their notes, sketches, and rough diagrams of the Betty's fuel system. It looked like a rough draft of an engineering exam. The tank placement was stretched along the wings, extending into the midsection. Good for balance, good for range, bad for surviving fire. One of the officers traced a finger along the schematics and said the Japanese designers were betting on one thing: avoiding being hit at all. That meant flying low at night, slipping past radar, or diving out of trouble instead of tanking hits the way American heavy bombers could. He said something like, "They built these things like greyhounds, fast, thin, not meant for a long fight." The others murmured their agreement. Then came the question nobody had dared to ask out loud until that moment. How many Japanese pilots had died because of these choices? The hangar fell quiet. Even the buzzing lamp sounded louder. You could see it on everyone's faces. They were imagining enemy crews trapped in burning planes, knowing the tanks around them were ticking bombs. War makes you think about all kinds of things you never planned on. The intelligence team spent another hour discussing how the Betty's weaknesses explained the way it behaved in combat. American pilots had always said the bomber lit up like a lantern when hit. Now they knew exactly why. One pilot recalled how he once saw a Betty ignite from wingtip to wingtip after a single burst. At the time, he'd thought it was some kind of ammunition cooking off. Now he realized he'd been watching those unprotected tanks giving up their lives all at once. Around midnight, when most sane people would be asleep, the officers finally wrapped up for the day. They closed their notebooks, tightened the tarp over the bomber, and walked out into the cool darkness. The stars were bright above them, sharp and cold. One of the younger pilots paused, staring up at the sky, and said softly that somewhere out there, Japanese crews were flying missions in planes just like this one, praying they didn't get hit. Nobody answered him. They didn't have to. And while the men drifted off toward their bunks, the Betty sat alone under the canvas, silent and still. A fragile machine caught between two worlds, built for distance, sacrificed for speed, doomed by decisions made in offices half a world away. The next morning would bring test flights, performance trials, and more discoveries about just how much the Japanese had gambled. But for now, the hangar rested and the bomber waited, holding its secrets a little less tightly than before. The next day broke with a soft breeze rolling in from the sea, carrying that faint salty smell that always seemed to settle in your clothes if you worked near the Pacific. The men drifted back toward the hangar with a mix of curiosity and caution. Today was supposed to be the big day, the first American test flight of the captured Betty. You could feel the tension in the air, almost like the plane itself was holding its breath. She sat there under the tarp, looking a little anxious, if a machine could ever look that way. Maybe it was just the way the fabric sagged around her wings, but I swear it looked like she knew what was coming. A small crowd gathered again. Everyone from flight engineers to clerks from the personnel office, all ready to witness something rare. Captured aircraft always drew a crowd, but this one felt personal. Maybe because so many men had seen Betties dropping torpedoes in the early days of the war, or swooping down in night raids with those eerie engine notes that stuck in your memory. Or maybe because this bomber, more than most, carried the fingerprints of the decisions that shaped the Pacific War, both brilliant and tragic. The pilot chosen for the test flight was a man named Ray Collier, tall, calm, with a quiet grin that made you feel like everything was going to be all right. He didn't brag, didn't boast, just nodded politely when the commander handed him the briefing packet. He'd flown everything, P-38s, B-25s, even a captured Zero once for evaluation. If anyone could wring truth from this fragile machine without breaking her back, it was him. Before climbing aboard, Ray walked a slow circle around the bomber, running his hand along the wing as if greeting an old horse. He paused by the fuel tanks longer than the rest of us. You could see the gears turning in his head. Every pilot knew what it meant to sit above that much gasoline without proper protection, but he didn't say anything. He just gave a short exhale, the kind a man gives when he's accepted something he can't change. When he finally climbed inside the cockpit, the crew watched in silence. The Japanese instruments were laid out in a way that made sense once you learned the logic, but it wasn't American logic. Ray slid into the seat, adjusted it, and tapped a few of the gauges. The needles shivered to life. The mixture controls felt light, almost delicate. He gave the throttle an experimental wiggle and said it felt like moving a paintbrush rather than a control lever. The engines coughed before they roared, awake, two deep, throaty growls that made your chest vibrate. For a moment, everyone held their breath, half expecting something to go wrong right then. But the propellers spun clean, smooth, eager. Say what you want about Japanese engineering decisions, those engines were no joke. They could hum like a choir when they were warmed up. The ground crew pulled the chocks and the Betty began rolling out of the hangar. The sun reflected off her skin in a soft glow. She looked different now, less like a wounded bird and more like something remembering what it was made for. Ray steered her to the runway, the twin engines purring like big cats settling into a hunt. When the tower cleared the flight, he pushed the throttles forward. The bomber surged ahead, faster than anyone expected for such a long-winged machine. The wheels lifted gently, almost reluctantly, and the crowd exhaled in one collective breath. For the first time since she'd been captured, the Betty was flying free again. Up in the sky, Ray kept his voice steady as he radioed back his observations. The controls were surprisingly light, almost too light. The plane rolled quickly, pitched sharply, and felt sensitive to every movement. That kind of responsiveness could make her feel nimble in the hands of a skilled pilot, but deadly for someone inexperienced or stressed. The wings flexed noticeably, a design meant to save weight but unnerving when you could see them bouncing in turbulence. Ray tested her climb, not great. Tested her dive, better. Tested her turning radius, decent but not exceptional. Then he moved to the part everyone dreaded, fuel management. He switched between tanks, checking for pressure drops, leaks, or temperature spike. And wouldn't you know it, the moment he phrased something like, "I think the left tank might be running a little hot," half the men on the ground felt their stomachs twist. The Betty didn't misbehave, but the readings weren't comforting. In American planes, fuel temperature and pressure stayed within tight, predictable ranges thanks to insulated tanks and controlled ventilation. In this bomber, everything ran hotter, riskier, like the plane was always walking a tightrope with its chin in the wind. Ray flew her for nearly an hour, gathering notes. Then, gently, he brought her back toward the runway. His landing was soft, almost affectionate. When the wheels kissed the ground and the engines wound down, the crowd started murmuring again. Nobody looked triumphant, just thoughtful. Ray climbed out, wiped his forehead with a rag, and stood there for a moment before speaking. He said something simple, something that stuck with every person who heard it. "She flies better than she lives." And wasn't that the truth? For the next few weeks, the evaluation continued. The Betty flew several more times, each flight confirming the same strange blend of strengths and frightening weaknesses. The range was incredible. The lift was elegant. The efficiency was remarkable. And the vulnerability, it was almost painful to face. The intelligence reports that followed painted a clear picture. The Japanese needed range above all else. Their war stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. They didn't have dozens of fortified bases or endless fuel reserves. They needed planes that could go far, so they stripped them down, shaved off weight, made them lean and fragile. Those unprotected tanks weren't a mistake, they were a decision. A risky one, a costly one, but a decision rooted in the brutal geography of the Pacific. The Americans reading those reports didn't feel superior. If anything, they felt sobered. War forces impossible choices, and this bomber was proof. Every scrap of rubber or layer of armor removed saved fuel, saved weight, gained distance. And every pound saved could be the difference between reaching a target or ditching in the ocean. Maybe the Japanese designers hoped that stealth, speed, and timing would keep their crews alive. But hope is a thin shield in a sky full of bullets. Now, before we push toward the final chapter of this story, let me take just a moment to ask something from you. If you've stuck with me through this journey, through the hangars, the test flights, the tough choices made by men on both sides of the war, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Give the video a like if it earned it, and share it with someone who loves the hidden stories of aviation. It keeps this channel breathing. Alright, let's wrap this tale up. In the following weeks, the Americans finished their analysis. The Betty was tucked into a quieter corner of the field, her flights complete. She looked almost peaceful, resting in the sun like an old veteran who'd finally been told she didn't have to fight anymore. Every time a mechanic walked past, they'd glance at her with a strange mix of respect and sadness. Some of the younger pilots started asking questions, big questions. Why would a nation send its young men into battle in machines so vulnerable? Why take such risks? and the older men, the ones who'd been around since the early days of the war, would tell them something simple. Every country makes mistakes in war. Every country learns too late. And every plane, even the flawed ones, carries the weight of the people who believed in it. One evening, long after the sun had disappeared and the last engine on the base had shut down, a few pilots gathered near the Betty. One of them leaned against the wing, staring at the faint moonlight glinting off the aluminum. He said he couldn't stop thinking about the crews who'd flown these bombers into battles they probably knew they wouldn't survive. He wondered what those men felt in the final seconds when tracer rounds found those unprotected tanks, whether they cursed the engineers or forgave them. Whether they thought of home. Nobody answered him, but they all knew the truth. Even the best planes in the world can't protect you from everything. And even the worst planes are flown by men with hopes and families and courage that doesn't make headlines. The Betty wasn't remembered for her triumphs. She was remembered for her sacrifices. The crews who flew her paid the price of decisions made far from the front lines, decisions shaped by desperation and necessity. And in some quiet way, that captured bomber gave the Americans a deeper respect for the enemy they fought. Months later, the war would shift. New planes, new tactics, new victories and losses. But that story of U.S. pilots examining a captured Betty and shaking their heads at those fragile tanks stayed with many of them for years. It softened something in them, reminded them that war isn't always about better machines or stronger armor. Sometimes it's about the thin line between survival and sacrifice. Some of those men would go home and tell their families about the strange bomber they once flew. Others would never speak of it again. The Betty herself was eventually scrapped, piece by piece, her metal melted down and folded into something else. Her shape disappeared, but her story didn't. Because stories don't vanish the way machines do. They linger. They slip through memory. They pass from one voice to another until one day someone like you sits down and listens to the tale of a bomber built for range, flown with hope, and lost to the harsh reality of war. And as we close this story, my mind drifts back to those quiet hours in the hangar, the way the men stood around that fragile machine, the way they talked about the choices that shaped her. It reminds me that behind every blueprint, behind every rivet and every tank, there's a human hand trying to do the best it can with what the world has forced upon it. And that, in its own quiet way, is the same spirit that carried the dambusters through their night of impossible courage. The same stubborn thread that runs through every chapter of aviation history. A mix of hope, fear, and the unbreakable will to face the sky, no matter the odds.